And I think my talk will actually touch on all the issues we've heard about so far. I'm not going to try and talk directly about my book. I'm going to try and take a few themes from it, which connect with this issue about classification. And I think one thing which connects with what we've heard so far, but I want to have as a backdrop to the discussion about how classification operates and the politics of classification. Well, actually two things. One of them is the methods we've heard about so far are mostly things like surveys, the census, survey questions, what gets measured through these kind of governmental devices. That's really important. And I think we've had a fantastic discussion about that. We're now living in a world, of course, where that apparatus is overlaid by the huge significance of digital and algorithmic classification. So if we want to understand today classification politics, we need to take into account the digital and the algorithmic mechanisms at work. And just to say, one thing I thought I'd do when I put this paper together was I have a new version of PowerPoint which prompts me with design ideas. And so I normally ignore it, but just this time I thought, okay, I'll let PowerPoint suggest to me some ways of designing my slides. I thought it'd be a bit of fun. Actually, about a third of the way through this presentation, it becomes really fascinating for what it tells us about the politics of inequality. So that's hopefully going to keep you a bit interested. That's one issue, but the second issue, which I want to put into play, is just the way in which inequality has emerged in the last 10 years as such a huge theme in public debate, in governmental discussion, and how that has also transformed some of the politics around classification, whilst also underscoring and emphasizing some of the older emphases. So I very much value what was being said so far. I think one of the themes we've heard about from all the speakers is about continuity and change to classifications. So classifications seem to rework categories, but in fact they're often reworking them around certain kind of familiar themes, and it's a matter of re-entrenching structural forms of inequality around race and gender and class and such like. So let me make a start. I'm going to try and keep to time, definitely. I really want the conversation afterwards to be for all the speakers, not specifically for me. Let me say a few words, though, first about the context of my interest in classification, because it really goes back to a book I wrote in 2010, which is about UK, about Great Britain. And it was an attempt to understand social change in Britain. And I began with the argument that when we look at social change in Britain, we often don't take account of that one of the major changes in that period, in the 20th century, has been the rise of social sciences themselves as a major form of expertise, knowledge, and intellectual drive, if you like. It often isn't recognized because social scientists are very good at putting themselves out of the picture. You know, we just measure stuff. We just sit on the sidelines seeing what's going on. And we're not so good at placing ourselves actually in the heart of the societies in which we are living and experiencing. And here I very much echo some of the comments which Nima made in her discussion about developments in India after the Second World War. I was very interested in the way that in Britain, after the Second World War, you found the social sciences becoming central to making a national state in the context of decolonization and changing global geopolitics. It's in the period after 1950 that you find a number of methodological repertoires becoming very mainstreamed. And actually the National Sample Survey is undoubtedly, I think, the most powerful of these, because the idea that you can represent a nation on the basis of interviews with a very small number of people through a sample mechanism is actually quite recent. It didn't really become established until the 1930s when Gallup polls began to take off. And it wasn't until the 1940s in the UK and around the same time in many countries that governments began to use sample surveys as a key mechanism to, in a sense, assess the health of the nation. So these days, we are surrounded by, indicators of national well-being, which are drawn from sample surveys often. The inflation rate, the growth rate, the unemployment rate, and all these things which we hear about on the radio are all to do with a certain way of establishing national well-being and becoming mainstreamed. This was also the period when the in-depth interview became a major device used by social scientists. And at this point in time, interviews move out of just being the focus of clerical and professional service, social work practice into becoming a mainstream tool of social scientific research. So Michel Foucault famously talks about the way in which the interview is a confessional device. It becomes a key apparatus of social scientific research at this point too. So both quant and qual methods become central to forms of nation state building. And that's all part too of the rapid rise of social sciences within university systems. And it's really important to recognize, and I think the British case is particularly striking here. In 1900, if you look at the university structure in the UK, social science didn't exist. I mean, I'm slightly exaggerating, but not much. Universities were composed of people working in humanities, law, religion, language on the one hand, humanities side, or in science, medicine, law on the other side. There were a few economists, not many. There were no sociologists. When we look at the university system now, that has transformed massively. So the social sciences in many universities are, the largest employer of academics, and a very high proportion of the student body is composed of social scientists. And of course, the LSE, in some ways, exemplifies this perfectly. LSE was formed in 1895. It becomes, central to state-building projects in 20th century Britain, and indeed through its role, through its global role in having a higher proportion of international students. Many of whom go back to other parts of the world and take on leading positions in new forms of government. And now, and of course, LSE became a major institution on the basis of its social scientific expertise. So, as we've heard from all the speakers, social sciences become a central part of an apparatus of governance, imperial governance, and after 1945, developing nation-state building projects. Give me a minute, I need to find my clock. Sorry about that, I left my watch. So the implications I really want to emphasize is we need to see social sciences as absolutely, we're not just critical commentators. Yes, we are critical commentators. We try to be critical commentators, but we are in the belly of knowing what Nigel Swift called knowing capitalism or neoliberal capitalism. And the knowledge circuits which social scientists of different kinds elaborate and champion have become fundamental to the way in which contemporary capitalism works. A classic example, actually, is the way in which interview methods, championed by anthropologists and sociologists, become absolutely mundane in the world of Facebook and social media. So these days, people are posting things all the time. They are eliciting accounts and putting them out there. That technology, if you like, goes back really to the way in which social scientists emphasized how useful it was and how important it was to get ordinary people's views through these interview methods. But in the last 2 or 3 decades, the classic methods of social science are losing their sheen. They're losing their excitement. And we can see this in several ways. When it comes to national sample surveys, we're seeing a structural shift in most parts of the world where people are less likely to do surveys. Response rates, which used to be extremely high, are falling. People no longer want to do another survey. We get fed up with having to do another tick box exercise, and it's harder, therefore, for survey companies and for governments to get a representative range of people to fill in their questionnaires. Now, of course, there is a whole battery of methods designed to make inferences to extrapolate to a nationally representative set of findings from a skewed or smaller sampling base. But nonetheless, the shift is still there. We're also seeing, with respect to interviews, the fact that, so I did some work for my previous book about the first generation of qualitative ethnographic research in Britain in the 40s and 50s. And what was very clear when we look at some of those studies is many of the people were so excited about being interviewed because no one had ever shown any interest in their lives at all. And so you could just see some of the interview notes making it very clear there's a sense of excitement. Wow, I'm being interviewed. It's such interesting experience. And you find the same thing too amongst the researchers, that we're going into a new area and we're finding out some new findings by doing these interviews. These days, we've all been interviewed to death. We're interviewed to death every time you apply for a job, through social media. We learn interview methods in our degrees, in our studies. And these days, we know what is being looked for, and therefore you find responses being tailored in a certain kind of ways, which is designed to elicit certain things which the respondent wants to give off, but not things which they want to keep safe. And that goes hand in hand with the fact that key arenas of social life become invisibilized. That's to say, powerful interests make certain things less easy to research, less easy to understand. And as Victoria was saying, I'm interested in wealth issues and the whole way in which tax avoidance operates is a key example of that. So the classic social science repertoires are under threat. They are under stress. On the other hand, we're finding this new apparatus of big data, what some people call data colonialism, which is increasingly powerful in forms of governance and securitization. I hardly need to say that. I mean, we're all familiar with this. But this is really transforming, I think, the way in which knowledge is being mobilized and used. So that was, I've been interested in those debates for a long time. That's one of the reasons why, when the new social science of inequality took off, really, in the last 10 years or so, I was very excited, because social scientists were taking the front foot, if you like, and they were saying, let's not fixate on the big data. Let's not get too depressed about how big high-tech companies are leading the way in terms of knowledge and expertise. We ourselves, the social scientists, have key findings which are going to energize public debate and change the way we think about social change and politics. And here are two books which you may know of, Capital of the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty, and Wilkinson and Pickett's The Spirit Level. These both became really important because they had a massive public as well as academic readership. Piketty's book sold 2.5 million copies in hardback. Wilkinson and Pickett's The Spirit Level, Why Greater Equality Makes Society Stronger, it sold 250,000 in Britain, and it led to the formation of a social movement, a kind of a political NGO, I guess, the Equality Trust. And it really made, it was a fantastic example of the way social scientists said, inequality is fundamental. We need to bring it out of the public and get that issue addressed. And so this is very exciting, because it seemed to be social scientists taking the lead. However, and this is the main point of my talk, it comes with baggage. And the baggage I want to talk about is the return or the re-entrenchment of a form of methodological nationalism. And I just want to talk that through with respect, to Marion Fourcade's emphasis that contemporary life is bound up with what she calls ordinalization or ranking. So we are all familiar with ubiquity of ranking. And one of the things which inequality research has done is it has facilitated the construction of all sorts of indices by which nations can be ranked in terms of their inequality. So paradoxically, although it's bringing to attention a key issue of politics, it's also inscribing another kind of political issue around how we view nations, how we rank nations, and how that process of methodological nationalism involved in that has a complex and problematic baggage. And I want to talk that through quickly, if I'm aware of the time, by just going back to Wilkinson and Pickett's study, which some of you may know. This is an iconic study, and it's a very important study. And let's be clear, it's a politically left-wing socialist study. Though I'm very sympathetic to it for that reason. And it proceeds by taking a certain number of countries, normally around 22. So here they are listed on this figure, treating them as autonomous units of measurement, and then ranking them on two axes. One of them is income inequality, and the other is, it varies in the book, have different measures, but the one here is a basket of indicators of life expectancy, maths and literacy, crime, teenage births, etc., etc. And as you see this graph, you can see there's quite a simple storyline in it, which is that the more inequality, the more problems. So the USA has the highest inequality. Even though USA is the richest nation in the world, it also scores worse on all these basket of things which are seen to be symptomatic of health and social problems. Japan is the contrasting case. Japan is relatively equal, and it scores much higher on those issues. So it's politically become very powerful, and it underscores a politics of saying, let's look to those nations, Norway, Sweden, Finland, etc., which appear to do better, and try and learn lessons from those countries and those policies in those countries to make our situation better. But the problem is, this inscribes a certain kind of methodological nationalism, which is Eurocentric, because most of the countries being measured are from Europe, but also it weights equally small countries with big countries. And this is particularly the case with the fact that the four Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, none of which has more than 10 million people living in them, as you can see, they're all kind of good countries on the bottom left hand of this diagram, but they're a tiny proportion of the world's population. And because there's four of them, they can really pull this regression line down to make that correlation appear to be strong. By contrast, the USA is the outlier at the top, much bigger country. But the point is, all these countries are treated equivalently. So here, the ones I put in this box are all under 10 million people. And if we add the ones with between 10 and 20 million people, we can see there's not many large countries left in this graph. And again, I want to emphasize, I very much agree with the politics of this argument, but methodologically, the way in which it proceeds by crunching together different national measurements and ranking them brings with it a significant legacy. Another example of this logic, which some of you may be familiar with, this became famous as the Great Gatsby curve, developed by the Canadian economist Miles Korak, which this time he ranks countries by their degree of inequality, more unequal countries on the right-hand side, and then also by their social mobility, which is measured by the degree of correlation between parents' income and respondents' income. And again, it shows exactly the same logic as does Wilkinson and Pickett. So it does have more countries, so you can see on the top right-hand side it includes some South American countries, but it has the same fundamental issues about how you're using nations as if they are autonomous units, which comes with a huge problematic baggage. And my final example is taken from the work of Oxfam. Now, Oxfam are really, really important because about 10 years ago, they deliberately shifted their agenda away from poverty reduction alone, poverty alleviation, to saying inequality is a problem. And that signaled a very significant shift in the way in which they didn't just want to say, let's try and raise people in poverty, but we actually need to tackle structural inequalities. And we have worked with them a fair bit, actually, as part of the work with the International Inequality Institute. And a couple of years ago, they came up with this index measuring how far different countries were committed to reducing inequality. And I don't want to go into the details of how it was constructed, but it was to do with policies around taxation, to do with social welfare and employment protection. And they assembled all these indicators together and they created a basket and they ranked countries. But the irony is, when you look at both the table on the right-hand side and the map on the left-hand side, in which the size of countries is graphed according to how much they are committed to addressing inequality, it's a deeply Eurocentric perspective they give, in which if you look at the top 10 countries who are most committed to reducing inequality, it turns out to be all European ones, whereas the ones who are least committed turn out to be in Africa and Asia. And you think about what's the politics of that? Are we really saying that Europe, with its history of colonialism and capitalism, is the good part of the world, if you like, and we should be somehow implicitly, at least, naming and shaming people in other parts of the world? So it's a strange implication of how you're using those ranking mechanisms. So this is a point I try and pull out in my book at various points. One of the ironies of the inequality turn in social science and in measurement and in the greater sensitivity to inequality in research has actually been to underscore a form of methodological nationalism, which tends to see nations thereby as kind of containers. It doesn't easily deal with migration issues, nor the scale of different places within countries, and it treats countries as equivalent regardless of size. And that therefore implicitly mainstreams a certain kind of Eurocentrism. Europe is really unusual because it has a quarter of the world's nations are European. But Europe does not have in a sense, one or two dominant nations in terms of population size. And it means that comparative research tends to focus upon Europe and intra-European comparisons, as if that is the analytical template for understanding inequality across the globe. When, in fact, the biggest countries in the world, China and India, dwarf Europe, but they don't get the same degree of analytical attention because you don't divide India up into different countries. Similarly, the way in which Europe is highlighted as an inequality beacon really obscures the fact that the longer-term historical and colonial role of Europe remains important in understanding inequality. And this is where my algorithm comes in, because it leads to my second point about, this is a big theme of the book. And we've heard a lot about colonies from all the speakers, particularly Nima and George. And so one of the arguments in my book is not just seeing the legacy of empire. We are actually seeing the return of empire as an active force. And so I typed in to PowerPoint empire and the return of history, and it offered me this picture of Egyptian pyramids, which is a fascinating way in which, why did PowerPoint think that the response to empire and the return of history would be a series of pyramids? Well, Orientalist assumptions, Western touristic assumptions about what those terms mean, which obviously there's no reason at all to think that this is in any way a helpful representation of what empire and the return of history should conjure up amongst a set of algorithms. I tried again, and this time I was given Machu Picchu as to represent what those terms mean. So there's a fascinating way, again, in which these imperial forms of governance and expertise get occluded, or they get distorted, if that's the right word, by PowerPoint, into this kind of touristic, Orientalist way of viewing things. And I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to try and be very quick. So really, I think what we need to understand about the way in which inequality research feeds into the changing forms of expertise is actually the return of what I call the return of empire. And the return of empire itself is bound up with the increasing weight of capital. And here I use a quote from Pierre Bourdieu, which I found very influential, very powerful. And Bourdieu emphasizes just how significant accumulation is over many, many years. And we mustn't see society as if it's cross-sectional, a series of cross-sections. It's actually always in a state of accumulation and building up. And he represents that notion to the notion of capital, which of course has resonance with Marx and also with the economics of Thomas Piketty. So interestingly, I don't think Piketty discusses this very much in his work, but one of his arguments is about the way in which in late 20th century and early 21st century societies, we are seeing an accumulation of capital resources. By capital, he means assets of any kind, whether it's a kind of property or savings or stocks and shares or whatever. And this is a very famous graph which he made famous in a way, which is to look at the proportion of capital as a ratio of national income across these different countries. And in every case, the proportion of capital is growing. What does that mean? That really, so I really want to contest this kind of forward-looking, futurist, accelerationist idea that we're moving on into this supercharged, turbocharged capitalism. I think the way to understand contemporary society is actually that the weight of the past is becoming greater and greater, and the accumulation of forms of inequality, of structural divisions is actually intensifying. And that explains, too, why, just my last two graphs, that explains, too, why historic resonances, say around the statues of imperialists, the notion of historic abuses, reparations, all these things are becoming powerful because they represent the way in which those historical forces have gained power. And my final point, I'm actually not going to be able to finish, but my final point is therefore to say, this is a conventional graph produced by the American sociologist Andreas Wimmer about measuring the amount of the world's land surface. So it's it's not very clear, but in the top right-hand corner, you've got a proportion of land governed as autonomous nation states, versus in the bottom left, areas governed as imperial or colonial dependencies. If you look at this, the implication is, over the 20th century, we all became decolonized, and the nation states become the norm. But that really misses the resurgence of these historical and imperial forces. And just one indication of this is again a graph produced by Piketty in his new book, Capital and Ideology, which is, I think, really interesting representation of the significance of foreign assets in historical perspective. And he's basically mapping out the amount of assets owned abroad by residents in particular countries as a ratio of national income. So you can see that the apex of colonialism, just before the First World War, in Britain, 180% that ratio, which means to say Britons own more resources abroad than they do in their own country. So huge, huge colonial apparatus. One of the interesting points from this graph is actually that British imperialism remains really right down to the Second World War. It wasn't until the Second World War, not the first, that British imperial power in those terms was diminished. And then what you can see too is there was a brief period between about 1950 and 1980 when those sorts of assets didn't seem to be so significant. So at this point in time, most income within countries is being earned within those countries. But over recent years, you're finding those foreign assets increasing significance again. The key players this time are Japan, Germany, and China. So really what this is suggesting is the return of imperial forces. Now, I don't have time to talk Eurocentrism, sadly, but just to finish on this last slide. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to recognize the power of research on inequality, which is about ranking nations and seeing that as a useful way of underscoring the significance of inequality. But we also need to recognize that we need to unpick the notion of nation itself. The major nations where there is growing levels of inequality, and this would include the United States, China, Russia, have strong imperial pretensions. I think Brexit's, I don't have time to go into this, but Brexit's a really interesting case. But Brexit is often represented as British nationalism. I don't think it's about nationalism. I think it's much more a kind of recovery of that imperial British image, which draws upon that long-term historical residue of Britain's position vis-a-vis its colonial hinterland, alongside its tie with Europe. I haven't got time to go into that, but I happily discuss that in Q&A. And you can find strong imperial overtones in many other smaller nations where you're finding increases in inequality, Russia, Turkey, India, and so forth. Interestingly, one thing I try and emphasize in this book is that inequality increase is not inexorable. There are some countries which have managed in the last 20 years to either contain inequality or to somehow limit it. Many of these, not so much in the last decade, but certainly in the decade between 2000 and 2010, were in South America. And they were often tied into projects of national reconstruction, if you like. You know, you can think about particularly countries recovering from authoritarian regimes, military regimes, Brazil being a case under Lula's presidency. So inequality rises isn't inexorable, far from it, but the return and the renaissance of imperial forms of governance and imperial forms of power is tending to lead towards more powerful, more privileged elites, and is tending to weaken, if you like, social boundaries, social relationships within the countries. Thank you. I know I covered a lot of ground there. Sorry about that. But